Hello, I'm Annie Larkin, Vice President and Director of Community Engagement of the Amerind Museum. Welcome to Dispersing Power, the Contentious Egalitarian Politics of the Salado Phenomenon and the Hohokam region of the United States Southwest with Louis Borck. Before we begin the program today, I want to acknowledge that Amerind is located in southeastern Arizona, on lands where O'odham, Hopi, Oshwe, Yoeme, and Apache families have lived for untold generations, and whose wisdom and traditions live on today in vibrant communities. We are grateful for what all of these communities, rich in history, have to teach us. Thank you to our program sponsor, Desert Diamond Casinos, as well as our members and donors who enable Amerind to provide free online programming and fulfill Amerind's mission to foster and promote the knowledge and understanding of the Native peoples of the Americas through research, education, conservation, and community engagement. To learn how you can assist Amerind in supporting its mission and programs by becoming a member or donor, please visit amerind.org. At the Amerind Museum in Dragoon this weekend, February 19th and 20th, there is a Mata Ortiz pottery show and sale with pottery artist Hector Gallegos Jr., Laura Bugurini, and Cesar Bugurini. Please be sure to visit the event section of Amerind's website or Facebook page for event details. And on February 26th at 11 a.m., Amerind will host the free online lecture, Songs of Power and Prayer in the Columbia Plateau, a common thread through tradition and change with Professor Chad Hamill. Please visit the events section of Amerind's Facebook page or website for registration details. Okay. Louis Borck is an assistant professor at New Mexico Highlands University, a founding member of the Black Trowel Collective, and the founding president of the nonprofit, The History Underground. He has worked at the Missouri University Research Reactor in the Archaeometry Group as an assistant professor at the Leiden University and at the Research and Outreach nonprofit Archaeology Southwest and the University of Arizona. He is interested in how social movements and contentious politics shape religion and politics through time, as well as how modern politics and worldviews shape the histories and archaeologies we construct, often recreating the histories and ideals of the, quote, West in the deep past. If you have any questions that you would like to ask today, please do so in the Q&A chat box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll gather those questions to share with our speaker after the presentation. And we will also be sending a link of the recording of today's program to all of our Zoom registrants later today. And with that, I'd like to thank you, Louis. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Annie. I'm gonna share my screen here real quick with you guys, and then we'll get going. Okay, so I am, as Annie mentioned, I'm going to be presenting to you guys on this topic that I've been working on for quite a while. I'll be focusing on new interpretations of what's happening in the Hohokam area, or southern Arizona, northern Mexico, really, from about 1250 to AD 1450, a time period of pretty dramatic change. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that change itself looks like as well. First, of course, I want to thank Annie and the Amerind Foundation for inviting me to give this talk. This is actually, in some ways, a long time coming. I had, with the under the previous director, we had put together a workshop seminar out at the Amerind, where a number of us came from all over the world and talked about how to use some of the theories that I'm going to be talking to you guys about today before I get into the nuts and bolts of the kind of material culture, the archaeology, and also the analysis that I have done for this. This is also a part of a book project that I'm working on, and so it's a small component. I'll try to expand in areas where you need some more background to figure out exactly why the heck I'm saying what I'm saying. Okay, so primarily this talk's going to examine how and why this thing we call Salado or Salado ideology, which is located right about where the one of these types of Salado pottery, which is also called Roosevelt redware, you may hear me pop back and forth between those, is located on this map. It's actually a little bit more extensive than that. You'll see later on as I show some maps. This thing's been this material culture, which impacts like site, how architecture is built, how sites are, where sites are located, all this kind of stuff. It's been previously argued to be everything from invading groups of people from the north to invading groups of people from the south, to more recent understandings of it as a religious practice that was started by migrants. And really, this is what I'm trying to do is look at how and why it became so widespread so fast during the mid-1200s to about 1450 AD. We don't see cultural practices kind of just explode across the scene the way Salado does, not very often, at least. And so we'll go through and examine older arguments of cultural and kind of technological change that happened around this time period in what's now southern Arizona, about 1450. And then we're going to examine those in comparison to the stuff associated with Salado. And we're going to look at this through some ideas centered on social movement theories, critical archaeological theories, and of course, O'odham histories, Akimel, Tohono, and O'odham histories. Most of this work's been published in Borck and Clark 2021, and then some more is coming out in Borck and Clark 2022. And there's a significant amount in my dissertation as well. And again, there'll be more coming out in other contexts. The analysis is focused on a data set that has 2,800 dated settlements with more than 12 rooms that are located throughout the Southwest. The focus is actually going to be on a subset of those. It's 580 sites that have ceramic data. And that's about a total of 4.7 million analyzed pieces of ceramics that make up the database that were analyzed for this portion I'll talk about towards the end. In addition to this, I excavated at 11 sites along the border of Arizona and Mexico. And the sites date from about 1200 to 1450. So everywhere from the San Bernardino Valley, just a bit to the east of the Amerind Foundation, in the extreme southeast of Arizona, all the way to the eastern edge of the Tohono O'odham Nation. So one of the kind of frameworks that I'm working with in here is trying to understand how the O'odham lost their past and the Hohokam were born. The O'odham didn't lose their past, I should say right off the bat. This is kind of terminology that Mike Wilcox here is using. And it's more how the O'odham past was removed from them by folks outside of that. And so as Mike writes, what's surprising is the degree to which their history has been largely ignored by archaeologists and historians and replaced with other more fantastic tales of disappearance or invisibility. The act of selection of deciding which stories to tell and how to tell them is a subtle yet pervasive instrument of conquest. And when the first groups of American archaeologists came to investigate reports of a massive irrigation system, large abandoned village complexes, and massive adobe great houses in the late 1800s, they had trouble believing that any connection existed between this advanced civilization and the starving and impoverished O'odham. Rather than documenting the tragic consequences of American agricultural policies and the recent collapse of the O'odham economy, they chose instead to invent an imaginary ethnic group based on the O'odham word Hohokam for those who have gone before. And so the Hohokam were invented and the Pima lost their past. And Pima, of course, is a misunderstanding by the Spanish, which basically means I don't understand you when they're asking Akimel and O'odham what their name was, right? And so as Mike says, one could argue that the most damaging collapses and failures that the O'odham have endured have been at the hands of scholars who have not accounted for their presence in a modern world or failed to tell the stories which explain that presence. And so my research is in part an effort to tell the stories which explain this presence. And it's focused on something that a lot of us archaeologists are really sure about, I guess you could say, which is this idea that technology isn't neutral. The stuff that we make, the things that we have, the things that we wear, all of it is a part of how we go about and live our regular lives, right? So as Donna Haraway said, it's inside of what we make and it's inside of us. We're living in a world of connections, and it matters which ones of these get made and unmade. And so a lot of what I'm going to be talking about and what most archaeologists are talking about when they're talking about how to reconstruct histories out of stuff is that there are ideas and choices and human behavior all sort of embedded within the materials that we're talking about. And so we're going to be talking about the context and obviously at a big scale, right? I'm talking about 4.7 million ceramics here. So we're going to be looking at this regionally instead of at one or two sites. I'm also going to be coming at this from a perspective using a theoretical framework called anarchism. It's generally or regularly misunderstood in kind of common parlance and in the media as well. It's often treated as synonymous with chaos. There's actually about 200 years of research and practical organizing that's really more oriented around how to create orders. So it seeks structures of, it seeks to kind of limit structures of authority and hierarchy. And it asks whether those systems are justified, as Noam Chomsky has said, and it assumes the burden of proof for anyone in a position of power lies on them when that authority isn't self-justifying. But the main thing here is that if we need to understand this as how to essentially organize without leaders. Anarchy, the term itself, actually comes from the Greek, and it means literally without leaders, without rulers. I'm sorry, not leaders, without rulers. Anarch is without ruler. And it's interesting, I've always found this incredibly interesting, that the way we understand how to translate without ruler is chaos, right? It says a lot about what we think kind of have underlying assumptions about in our society about how people can organize successfully or create community, as it were. And so just a little joke here, as a quote from the Joker. So let's introduce a little anarchy, upsetting the established order, and everything becomes, and the reality is it becomes more equitable, right? So I get that anarchy is a scary term because of how it's popularly presented, but anarchism is really only scary if you see a concern with how people organize an orderly society in the absence of rulers and elites as a negative, or if your power derives from the state and capital, right? So otherwise, it's pretty much just a well-traveled kind of methodological and theoretical approach for understanding how people organize in the present and the past. And it's got a very long history in the West, going back to the 1700s. One of the main people involved in the founding of the American Republic, Thomas Paine, was an anarchist as well. And it's pretty prominent in the present, right? Some of the more important people in our history in the United States were anarchists. Lucy Gonzalez Parsons is one of my heroes, and she's Indigenous and African-American. She was born enslaved to enslaved parents in Texas. She eventually left and moved to Chicago, where the Chicago police said she was more dangerous than 1,000 rioters. She helped found the International Workers of the World. And her work, along with many others in the Midwest at that time, is the primary reason we have a 40-hour work week in the US, at least. And during that, her husband and 3 other men were murdered during this thing called the Haymarket Affair, which is the origin of our global Labor Day, basically. So this is just a real brief kind of overview of this idea, right, that anarchy is order. Proudhon, who was a theorist, contemporary of Karl Marx's, declared in the mid-1800s that anarchy is order. That's actually why that O shows up around the O and the A for those signs. So anarchist scholars generally argue that hierarchies are resisted through things like consensual decision-making, heterogenization, like making things less similar, right, mutual aid, cooperation, all this kind of stuff. And so we'll talk about that a bit. We're also going to kind of frame things in this way that Chandra Mohanty kind of sets up for us, which is that each of us carries around those growing up places, the institutions, a sort of backdrop as a stage set. So often we act out the present against the backdrop of the past, within a frame of perception that is so familiar. And I would actually argue that we can flip that, right? We can actually say that so often we act out the past against the backdrop of the present as well. So even when we're being scientific, even when we're trying to do reconstructions that are as close to our data as possible, we act out the past in the present, right? So what the heck does this mean for archaeology though, right? Well, one of the things that it asks us to do is actually to reevaluate some of these ideas that are often critiqued, I guess you could say, within archaeology, but still have a kind of implicitly laid foundations for how we think about the world. I mean, even our textbooks or courses are often framed this way, where you take like courses on hunter-gatherer societies, and you take courses on middle range societies. These are things like tribes and chiefdoms, and then you take courses on state level societies. We always joked in grad school that we had to fulfill our savage slot, right? Because it's really just replicating these kind of patterns. And the pattern is that people have essentially early on had decided that there is this kind of unilinear path that people move from, and originally it was uncivilized to civilized, right? That's why it goes savagery, barbarism, civilization. We've reframed that in the modern world within anthropology and archaeology in particular as complexity. And so now we're talking about these earlier types of kind of social organizations, economies, politics, what have you, as being less complex, right? Bands and such, and then moving up into more complex types of these kind of relationships. So complexity is really a research perspective that was supposed to fix this bias by creating a more kind of continuous evolutionary approach than the previous stage-based model. Interesting, a lot of what we end up doing, this is just one slide from a larger slide that I usually give on this, is it basically made all of our definitions for what's complex, what is civilization versus non-civilization, what a state is even, by archaeological work and historical work that was showing up or being done on societies around the Mediterranean, right? These are early anthropologists who were really interested in basically the art and statuary from these civilizations, these societies. So anything that looks different than those is bound to look less than, right? Because it'd be kind of like trying to go out and evaluate all other sports in the world against American football, right? And so everything would look different and not quite like football. So it's really hard to find kind of a replication of these things that we had looked at before. So we have this situation where the definitions that we're using, these things that we talk about as people trying to build societies, purposely create new types of organization, always kind of aggregating, growing, right, adding on to. I'll do public writings pretty regularly, and I'll often see in the comments like, oh, these native groups clearly were not progressing at all because their populations had not grown, right? Which is one, has nothing to do with progress, but it really shows these kind of underlying ideas of like growth is really what you need for progress, right? And so we get this idea that a civilization is this urban kind of aggregating and rational product, right? Things that you're purposely trying to make happen. Then anything that goes in the other direction from that, anything that's deurbanization or deaggregation, it must be non-rational or non-deliberate. It's often assumed that way. And we use terms like regression or dissolution or devolution or collapse to describe these things. My favorite is post-classic, right? It sounds kind of, I don't know, neutral, but it really means it's less than the classic period. And so this really kind of makes us think about these transitions into sort of hierarchy and urbanization and aggregation as purposeful attempts, and moves away from that as accidental or non-deliberative, or the only way sometimes that people can approach a social crisis is to reorganize into smaller, more dispersed societies. And so that actually means that a lot of times when people are researching this thing called collapse, we can really just break it down into a research question, which is, why did that collapse happen? And what was the exact result of that collapse, right? Investigative and descriptive, really. So these swings from centralized to decentralized organization are often approached in this way. But there's a really great quote from an old evolutionary ecologist in the United States named Christopher Hawk, not old as in age, but as in from further back in time. And he says there's nothing in North American ecology by itself to compel either Iroquois institutions or the Constitution of the United States. So really, this is someone who oftentimes is interested in understanding things environmentally, right? But he's arguing that a lot of these things that are happening don't make sense within just these environmental contexts. So we often have to look at historical context to help us situate explanations for change within changes that are happening through time. All these lead up to these really interesting choices that people are making during these kind of social or environmental hinge points, where society can potentially change in multiple directions, right? People regularly make the choice when there are environmental crises, social crises, political crises, economic crises, to become more and more and more hierarchical, right? That's how we get dictatorships, that's how we get fascist societies. Oftentimes archaeologists assume that that isn't what happens and that people reject that hierarchy. And so we have to actually ask ourselves, not that they reject that they're just not thinking about it and the social system kind of dissolves. So we actually have to ask ourselves regularly, like, are these choices that people are making? And what would the outcome of those choices be, basically? So a lot of what we research in the Southwest too is really interesting and conforms a lot to these ideas that people have put forward before about what a civilization or a state might look like, right? This wonderful gentleman named Sev Fowles, who's a researcher in the Southwest, argued that this new kind of focus on complexity really just encourages us to read human history as a process of acquisition in which more and more structure is amassed over time, right? So it doesn't really move us away from that linear understanding of progress. It just kind of changes the framework. And as one of the well-known theorists within this kind of progressive idea of social systems says, if evolution is defined as a change in the direction of increasing complexity, then the opposite change in the direction of simplification cannot be evolution. I would employ some other word like dissolution, devolution, or retrogression, right? So here we've got a real clear understanding that even as we try to move away from these terminologies that imply less than with these groups organized in certain ways, we still have that sort of understanding, right? So the main idea here is that intentionally building society really just seems to be one directional, with nature, crises, all this kind of stuff working against it and kind of tearing it down to an earlier level. But the reality is that, especially within those kind of indigenous frameworks that we started with, that Mike was talking about at the beginning, and the anarchist frameworks I kind of ran you guys through super fast, we get this idea that history is actually produced through tensions, right? And it's in the social negotiations within those tensions that are also within material constraints, like the environment and what resources you have, those types of things, that we get drives towards more centralized power and drives towards more distributed power. And this isn't a binary, right? There's not one or the other. It's on a wide continuum. And when we start to think about these tensions and these kind of power dynamics that are flowing through society, more like water, right? Instead of like, yes, you have power, nor you don't have power. We start to actually look at these hinge points that have previously been called collapse, which we might instead call a reorganization, right? And then the, whether it's the environmental or social inflection, whatever was happening at the time that that reorganization or potentially that collapse happened, because there are collapses. And then we actually have to ask ourselves, we go the old choose your own adventure route, right? So did people purposely decide to move into more hierarchical or more vertical politics or political organizations? Did people purposely decide to move into more horizontal or egalitarian politics? There's a lot of studies within organizational frameworks that actually argue that there's nothing against maintaining or increasing hierarchy. In fact, people more often choose to do that because it's an easier solution than essentially going more horizontal. Because while that actually ends up with you getting more and more kind of answers and potentials for figuring out how to get through this kind of crisis event, it is also involves a lot more groundwork to organize. Okay, so this really brings us to the Hohokam world, right? Much of southern Arizona. And depending on who you are as a Hohokam researcher, many will really put this centered pretty heavily in the Phoenix Basin. I'm not one of them. I look at the Hohokam world as mapping with O'odham histories, which puts us across much of southern Arizona and northern Mexico as well. So the long-term history of people in this region is pretty complex, right? Even when they're not living in societies that anthropologists or archaeologists would necessarily call complex. And this is where we get the earliest irrigation systems in Tucson Basin, the most extensive irrigation systems up in the Phoenix Basin. And we move from this really kind of dispersed, unplanned community layout with very little evidence of social stratification or ranking or hierarchies that are very, and then moving into kind of organically planned communities with massive earthen ball courts, all with also with minimal levels of hierarchy, and then eventually into these periods with monumental earthen platforms, mounds, and evidence of elites, both archaeologically and ethnographically through oral histories. We see that, and this isn't like there's a king in Phoenix Basin who's controlling all of the Hohokam world. This is sort of like what we might call heterarchy, where you have rulers in kind of dispersed, right, throughout the area, people who are in charge of different zones, and often seem to be in charge of the religious practices that are happening. We'll talk about that in a little bit when we look at some of the oral traditions, because it's definitely understood that these are the people who are giving the power to control, like rainfall by Elder Brother, one of the gods in the O'odham world. So this is an example of the complexity of the O'odham or ancestral O'odham Hohokam kind of world or labor projects, right? A lot of this labor was actually done when we don't really have evidence of these kind of rulers or these elites. And a lot of the sort of assumptions that we make within social sciences is that it's a lot of these big labor projects are done best under these kind of rulers. And the reality is it happens the most under them because it's easiest to have one person making decisions. But we see these massive labor projects like this happening under kind of horizontally organized or democratically organized or egalitarian organized groups, right? We've got sites like Poverty Point in the American Southeast, and then the irrigation systems of the Hohokam are another great example of this. So this is something, this really indicates that power isn't really just something that can be mobilized to compel labor to make people do stuff, but it also works along horizontal factors, and we can have power to do, like with each other, right? So communities can come together and do that. And these projects made by these communities were so important that we wouldn't have Phoenix where it's at in the contemporary world if it wasn't for these. A lot of these canals were also built during the Classic period, which is when we get those platform mounds and evidence of elites and stuff. But the major projects were really undertaken prior to that, what we call the pre-Classic. These are some examples of the canals, right? These aren't tiny little, these aren't what I'm making in my backyard to try to drain a flooded area or something, right? These are massive, and they're huge undertakings that, you know, entire communities or multiple communities, and will, you know, require constant upkeep and maintenance. They're incredibly deep, right? So these are, again, extensive systems. Each one of those kind of black and white alternating bands is a meter on the stick. And so these can go quite deep. Think of them as like roughly 3 feet, if you will, a little less than that. So these were in use for millennia in some cases, continually expanded until about the time that folks are switching from these more equitable kind of organizations, where the ritual practices, religious practices were very landscape oriented. Everyone was participating in them, to ones that are more prominently focused around the kind of practice being controlled by these elites. Other people would participate in them, but the elites really held the knowledge for how to do them. Okay, so during the earlier periods, in these more kind of dispersed equitable periods and O'odham histories, or Hohokam histories, we see structures that were houses and pits. They've got a footprint like this. They're basically wattle and daub is what we would call them now. And then we eventually start to get these really large irrigated fields and houses set up in small groups that we call courtyard groups, that archaeologists and anthropologists have argued that they're look to be kinship based, so closely related individuals. On the bottom right there, those are actually outlined canal systems and irrigation fields. Okay, by about 1250 to 1300, we start to see platform mounds constructed and spread throughout the Hohokam world. We get earlier ones that often a little bit smaller in the Phoenix and Gila Bend areas. This period is commonly considered to be the most hierarchically organized period in the region up until this point. Not everyone believes that, but you see that in O'odham oral histories, and that seems to be the what we're looking at with the material histories, the archaeology as well. But again, it's more like locally hierarchical and regionally horizontal, right? So you've got all these kind of chiefs or rulers set up across, or elites really set up across in different areas, multiple within different valley systems, right? None of them are necessarily in control of the other one. So it's more, again, akin to these earlier interpretations of like kind of regional hierarchy with kind of a large scale balance of power between these elites. This is artist reconstruction of the Pueblo Grande mound with an attached residential unit on top. These seem to have been developed later and not with every place. But a lot of what we can tell during this time period, you know, up until about 1450 really, is that the religious practices were often, not all, but often they're restricted to the platform areas and restricted access for those who were non-elites. We start to see walls put up on a lot of the tops of the platform mounds as well. These structures look radically different than the ones, obviously, that I showed you just a bit ago here, right? Hugely different. There's a lot of similarities. There's also these things called courtyard groups, which you can see along the edges of this platform mound and out further afield. And these actually kind of replicate the household and kind of structural pattern that we saw with those earlier kind of courtyard groups and stuff. So we know that there's still kind of similar patterns underlying some of these constructions, and we're definitely sure that it's the same people who are making this, who are building these platform mounds versus the earlier kind of dispersed communities. And then this all comes to an end. Right at the end of this period, we start to see pit houses start to show up again that look like those earlier forms. And sometimes you'll even see them dug right into the top of these platform mounds as well. I won't talk too much about that, but it's an interesting pattern to me. And then when the Spanish show up, O'odham are living in houses like this, right? So these kind of wattle and daub structures similar to those ones that aren't pit houses where they're dug deep into the ground, but just have a slight base dug in and then have this kind of wattle and daub exterior. And this transition from the platform mound system to people either disappearing, as some archaeologists have argued, or living in these dispersed kind of wattle and daub communities is what archaeologists have called the Hohokam collapse, right? So partially because of the massive difference, partially because of these assumptions in kind of complexity and the linearity of that complexity. And there's some other arguments made for this that I'll talk about in just a little bit here that are environmental, right? They're not just saying, we don't think these people could be complex. What they're saying, you know, this happened because people had no choice but to make these kind of dissolutions, these into smaller communities, right? During this time period, we get this movement of people, of Pueblo groups, individuals and communities from up north, moving down into the Hohokam world. And this is the maps from work that's been done by folks at Archaeology Southwest, including folks like Jeff Clark, Pat Lyons when he was still there before he was at ASM, Deb Huntley, and myself, Brett Hill as well. And there is some architectural changes that happen when these migrants move down. And then we get some new material culture show up in the form of these Salado polychrome vessels. And they are pretty dramatically different than the types of pottery that we see people making in these areas originally. By the earliest time period that these migrants show up, usually coming from the Kayenta area, but also probably from the Tucson region as well, we have these types of pottery that look really similar to what they're making in their homelands, but with contemporary clay. Arguments for this group, for this new type of material culture, and sites that have a ton of Salado polychrome on, or Roosevelt redware on them, were that we, you know, had like invading Pueblo groups, or that this is like a religious cult, which is not cult in a bad way, but like it's a new kind of religious practice. Jeff Clark has argued that really what we're looking at is an inclusive religious ideology, where they're bringing in as many of the Hohokam locals as possible. So migrants are creating it and kind of managing it, but they're integrating locals as much as possible. I'll talk about this later. My research really argues that it really only happens because of the interaction between migrants and O'odham. So Salado's not simply a migrant thing. It's a very local phenomena from this interaction between migrants and Hohokam locals and the political environment that the Salado migrants and the locals are living in at this time period down south. But during this period, we see an increase in trade in things like obsidian, particularly from the Mule Creek source, and as well as ideas, is what Patty Crown has argued, by the pretty rapid transmission of and regularity of how people make these particular types of vessels. And as you'll see, I'll argue, it's not just how to make pottery that's getting transmitted. Okay, so one of the things we know is that the production of this pottery is really decentralized. It's happening in not every village that you have this pottery at, but many of the villages that you see it in. It's at least happening in each kind of region that you see the pottery showing up at, sometimes traded more widely, often just exchanged within that region. And it's always been kind of considered to be made just by these migrants and their descendants. And I'll come back to that again, but we've got more evidence that points to it being made by what we'd consider Hohokam folks, right? And I'm going to try to break those barriers down, because I don't think the barriers between groups is as firm as archaeologists often treat it. So arguments that people have made for why the heck the Hohokam world sort of collapsed have a lot to do with environmental factors. So one, there's a dramatic kind of population collapse from starvation due to irrigation collapse in the Phoenix Basin. And some of that's actually been, actually a lot of it, it's linked with blown out canals. A lot of it's been reanalyzed, and folks like McClelland have actually argued that the earlier evidence of starvation on human remains, evidence on their bones, was actually misunderstood. And so regardless, this is one data point, right? At best, it's the Phoenix Basin. At worst, it's a one site, Pueblo Grande. Other arguments is that we get a slow population decline rather than a mid 14th century collapse or continued growth until the Europeans invade the region in the early 1500s, right? And this is kind of the argument for what we're seeing both in the Phoenix Basin as well as the San Pedro Valley, just to the east of Tucson, and just north of Phoenix as well. So we also get the idea that we have migrant invaders coming into these areas, particularly that's early argument for what's happening in Phoenix and the Tonto Basin. And then just in general, we have arguments that there's this broad regional downturn that's linked to, this kind of population collapse, as well as a kind of slow, dramatic decline. This is based on tree ring reconstructions and settlement data. And this is happening all over the Southwest, right? It's not limited to what's going on in the southern Arizona region, northern Mexico region at all. And what we now know, when these arguments were originally made, we thought this was the worst drought that had happened. What we now know is there are worse droughts that were happening earlier in time. And the O'odham, the ancestral O'odham, Hohokam, are very much drought resistant in a lot of ways because they're working with irrigation systems instead of rainfall patterns, and some irrigation like we see more often happening up north. All right, so again, why are people, if they are having these environmental impacts on them, right, that are impacting them in ways where the society seems at risk, right? And they're moving up through these kind of patterns of complexity that people have talked about. Why would people, I guess the question that we have to ask is, why would people choose to kind of disaggregate, to turn around and move into these really kind of dispersed settlements, when so often we have people during periods of crisis turn to strong rulers, right? Folks who unilaterally will make decisions for other folks in their communities. And so why didn't these individual crisis events lead towards increased levels of hierarchy across the Hohokam world instead of decreased levels of hierarchy? Why did the platform system end, right, instead of having people increase in power? And so that moves us into these O'odham histories for this time period. So according to Thomas van Yico, who's a Akimel elder that Barr had interviewed, O'odham ancestors built the Vakis, which is also Vapaki, and these are the great houses, the platform mounds. An elder brother appointed the chiefs to live in these and to be medicine men and to have more power than the rest of the people. And then Van Yico and Blackwater say after giving them this power, they started fighting. So, and I'm paraphrasing this next part, chiefs like Buzzard thought himself as powerful as the gods. Chiefs like Takanamkan Sivanyi, who's Sun Power medicine man, and Siltank Sivanyi, who's the blue turquoise medicine man from Casa Grande, fought viciously over access to elite goods. And this conflict between the medicine men or chiefs that were given power was so great that elder brother eventually had that conflict give birth to Hohok, and evil was introduced into the land. Hohok punished these people for this greed that was so rampant amongst the powerful. And because of this punishment, Buzzard, who is the Vapaki from Buzzard's house, who already thought he was as powerful as a god, killed elder brother. And then elder brother's death actually brought drought to the ancestral O'odham world, right? Linking up with this kind of pattern of decreased rainfall that we're seeing. And elder brother eventually was able to return for vengeance against those who'd killed him, and seemingly as well taken advantage of the power that he'd bestowed to them. And when he returned, he granted power to many people who were basically to everyone who was following him, none of whom were the chiefs or medicine men in charge of the Vipaki. They all were originally given the power to bring rain. Now everyone who followed Elder Brother was given the power to bring rain, right? A switch from kind of who controls the knowledge to bring, make society be successful, right? So Elder Brother also taught all the people who sided with them to conduct ceremonies that would bring them rain. And then following Elder Brother's return, his raising of an army of newcomers and him giving them all the power to bring rain, Elder Brother's army then divided into 4 parts to overcome the Vipaki rulers. One army went to the south and spread east to west. Another went further south and spread east to west. And another one went into the Phoenix Basin and spread east to west. And then one went further north and spread east to west. The east to west thing is interesting. So what we see when you actually map out these kind of patterns of change in how power is distributed using evidence from categories based on from ethnohistory, archaeology, mortuary, and how sites are set up, sizes of different structures, et cetera. We get these stages like I was talking about earlier that are more equitable. We move into slightly more hierarchical stages, then kind of move back into more equitable stages, and then move into much more hierarchical stages during the platform mound period. And then we get to the Salado sites, which are all over the Southwest. And we don't have evidence of these types of unequal relationships, right? And so they're definitely much more equitable. And so I got really interested looking at how the majority of sites that are a majority of Salado polychrome were organized, because we do see Salado polychrome on sites that have platform mounds, but the vast majority, 95% or more, are on non-elite sites, right? So this isn't a straight trajectory. This is what some folks have called a multilinear trajectory, where you're getting up increases and decreases in complexity, but always with some form of growth. The decreases are never as far down as the earlier lower versions, right? So that's, again, an argument of related to growth. And then at the very end here, with this yellow line down there around 1450, we get this return to pit houses, right? And that's happening right at the end of the Salado stuff. And this all looked really coincidental to me. And so this made me, kind of combined with the things I was talking about earlier, made me start to think about the assumptions we have that underlie our decisions. And so I wanted to think about what that might look like if we kind of invert this, if we subvert it, right? And this is a painting that my friend Leslie Aragon did of these kind of jargony, I guess, hyperbolic native scenes, with a woman's doing all the labor and half naked, and the men are like running around and doing all the big game killing and that kind of stuff. Kids are chasing animals. She just flipped everything, right? Dogs taken off after the kid. What happens if we look at this in 180 degrees? Mike Wilcox asked us to do that as well. So I went through to do this, and I did a multivariate analysis using data from those 580 sites, 4.7 million sures, really 591 because I added the sites I excavated at as well, to actually understand how people were interacting with Salado polychrome Roosevelt redware as it spread through the landscape, and to better understand who we'd expect to be picking it up as through time as it moves between neighbors, versus who picks it up much earlier than we would expect versus who picks it up much later than we would expect. And what we see through time, and all the sites that are on these maps are actually inhabited at the time period we're talking about. And right now we don't really have any evidence of Salado polychrome. And here, these sites outlined in black are where we start to see that they are existing a generation or two after migration from the north into the south. But by 1300, by the end of this period, Salado polychromes really become a local phenomenon. And it's emerging again from the interaction and the synthesis of migrants and local groups, right? It's no longer a Pueblo thing. It's very much a Pueblo and local Southern Arizona autumn thing, whether it's coming about from intermarriage and children from those marriages, or from exchange of information, probably from both. We're seeing this show up not just at sites that primarily have evidence of these migrants, but at sites that have historically been local sites, right? So it becomes a primary or predominant ceramic on these areas. That orange line is this kind of hypothesized kind of neutral spread, how things would spread if it was just useful, right? But didn't have any extended sort of interest focused on it. And so the sites that you see that aren't circled in black are ones that we would call resistors to this Salado framework. We see it push back against quite a bit in the Tucson Valley, Tucson Basin. And then 1350 to 1400, we see, you got areas down in the southeast of Arizona, down by the Amerind, where people are picking this up much earlier than you would expect them to. And then by 1400, 1450, you've got only a few communities that have it that aren't within this kind of broader Salado framework, so up by Hopi and Zuni. So most places in southern Arizona have it, not everywhere, as you can tell. Down by Babakiveri in the Chihuahuan lowlands and out by the Papaguria, out by the Tohono O'odham Nation, there are many people who are not involved with using this. And I was actually curious, why are some people not picking it up, right? Why are some people picking it up earlier than other people? And why do people like for a very long time not pick it up? And then why does it just disappear basically at 1450? And so I looked at social movement theories to try to understand this. And social movements are organizational structures and strategies that empower oppressed populations to mount effective challenges and resist. And I also would add here, avoid the more powerful and advantaged elites. They represent a method of social change from the bottom, right? Not elite-driven changes. So here I just kind of combine all the maps, right? And outline where we get early adopters and where we get Salado resistors. And one of the things that we actually start to see here is that instead of simple distributional discrepancies, we actually see variable reactions to Salado ideology. And these variable reactions are important because they give us a large-scale context to understand how people are reacting to it, right? So they reveal fissures in the Hohokam region's ideological landscape. And we can understand that using a concept called framing from social movement theory, which is basically that social movements, and even if you're not looking at social movements, just society at large, comprises many individuals. Social movements itself comprises people that are intent on changing these social values and institutions they view as oppressive. Framing actually is how we can understand the movement of these ideas of resisting that kind of oppression into groups who hadn't previously been participating. And if we look at it this way, we can see there are some areas where Salado just doesn't move very well. And there's other areas where it moves really, really well. And where it moves really, really well are in these areas of where the platform mounds are most common, or some other form of hierarchy, like in the southeast of Arizona and northeast or northwest of New Mexico, where we start to see at this time period, we're seeing kind of the outreach of the Pakime system down there as well. Where it doesn't move is areas where there's already an equitable pattern in place. So up north, people had the Kachina system had started up, and that horizontalized a lot of some of the kind of hierarchical tendencies that were propping up in the north based on the Kiva system and control of knowledge systems within that, right? So it distributed power more horizontally. In the south, within the Babakiveri, or Babakamari, sorry, and over to the west in the Coyote Mountains, we actually have one is a very dispersed kind of equitable system anyways. And in the Coyote Mountains, we have basically a reframing, a rebuilding of the platform mound system where each community has its own. They decentralize this platform mound system. Where Salado is in place is where we then see the emergence, usually, not always, but usually, of this return to the pit house system, this a pattern of kind of dispersal of populations and change in political practice that's happening as well. And we often can see this move through, we actually see this move from the east to the west through the Tucson Basin, but we see it move from the east to the west throughout much of the O'odham world as well. So based on this, I've made an argument that Salado was this large-scale, rapidly mobilized, relatively speaking, religious and political social movement that emerged from the interactions of migrants and locals, not from the migrants, not from the locals, but from the interaction between the two. It was a product of the political moment in the southern Southwest, where these earlier types of pottery that the migrants brought down with them were transformed into more ideological, powerful forms. It wouldn't have happened if they moved somewhere else. So the nature of the politics of contention is actually visible in how and where Salado spreads, because it spreads best where it's contesting hierarchical power practices. A lot of these pulveron-faced pit houses are often full of Salado polychrome as well. So with these transitions to more horizontally organized power structures, Salado actually ended, right? Understanding social movements, we also know they don't continue after they're not needed anymore. They disperse, they fall apart, right? There's no reason to continually fight against something that you've successfully ended. And so when these platform-bound systems fall apart, Salado dissipates. And it's not very successful in areas where it wouldn't be needed, right? And so we can also look at this. Nope, sorry about that. That's actually not lined up very well. We can also look at this in comparison to the O'odham histories, where medicine men were put in charge of the rituals for how to bring rain, things like that, where there's clear hierarchies associated with the platform mounds, the Vipakis, right? And so there's ritual practice there. Current research indicates Salado's centered around a ritual practice as well. Elder brother taught everyone who sided with him these rain ceremonies because the ritual practice, we think Salado's oriented around as participatory and not restrictive. Everyone can engage in it, right? Everyone's got the power to participate in these ceremonies, bring the rain back. And then following Elder Brother's return, he raised an army of newcomers and he gave all of them the power to bring rain, right? Just like number 2 says. And the armies, depending on where they're at, all move east to west. Salado spreads variably, but first moves to the south. And then in most areas, it spreads east to west. It follows this east to west trend, right? And so in the end, Salado is probably better characterized as an anti-hierarchical or anarchic social movement with relatively open access to religious knowledge. And the ultimate trajectory of this movement arguably is the social reorganization into the dispersed communities near the end of the classic period of the Pulveron phase, because we see a lot of decentralization of power practices happening during that time period, and that continues into the European colonial period as well. So our views to close, right? Our views on how social change should go can lead us to missing potential purposeful rejections of this type of social change. And material highlights this may give us deep insights into the meaning of rebellion and resistance and Indigenous survival and much more complex histories than we're often writing for them. And I'm not going to read everyone's name on this because there's a ton of people to thank for this, but needless to say, it was a ton of people, including folks at University of Arizona and Archaeology Southwest and the Amerind Foundation, whose collections I worked with. If you guys are interested in more research similar to this, there's an online bibliography of folks pulling from some of these perspectives as well. That's it.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful program, Louis. We do have some questions.
Yeah, of course.
Our first actually has to do with your bio. Would you tell us more about the History Underground, and is there a way to join?
Yeah, I can. So what I would say first is to email me. And we don't have memberships, but what we are doing is constructing field schools or scholarships or internships really for field schools to fund Indigenous and Black archaeological students to help them move past some of the economic barriers that often keep a lot of folks from historically excluded communities moving into the field of archaeology. In the process of doing that, we're also doing 2 different lecture series that are amplifying marginalized voices and perspectives within archaeology. So there's a website, you can Google it. It's thehistoryunderground.org. And otherwise you can email me too. And I'm happy to talk to you more about it.
And we've also had a request if you could share your list of sources about anarchy with our viewers today, perhaps in the follow-up email that
yeah, I can do that in a follow-up for sure. And if you know, for how it's used within archaeology, that bibliography I showed, if you just Google anarchist archaeology bibliography, it'll show up. And or you could go to the Black Trowel Collective's website, and there's a link to it through there. It's actually, I think, transitioned into the Black Trowel Collective's website. And that's all the, I think, except for like the most current 3 that came out in the last couple of months, publications that have happened in the last like 14 years or so. And then within that, there's a lot of citations to the kind of broader theoretical perspective of anarchism that's been playing out within geography and sociology and anthropology and even within like kind of philosophy of science, and obviously within the activist realm as well.
And for those who have not visited Hohokam sites, which would you recommend that they visit?
Oh gosh, that's a really hard question, because they're all pretty awesome in their own way. One of the things that's really nice though is to hit one that has kind of everything there. So you can see like the ball courts, and you can see the platform mounds, and then you can also be close to some of the sites that were involved in some of these earlier stages as well. So I really recommend hitting up like Casa Grande between Phoenix and Tucson, because they've got ball court sites as well as the Great House there as well, which is linked strongly within to individuals, named individuals within O'odham histories as well. That's kind of always an interesting thing. We try not to do that in archaeology, right? We're doing histories from the masses up, but it's always fun to be able to connect with an individual. Also within Tucson Basin, there are a couple of really wonderful sites. One that I would recommend going to is Los Morteros as well, and that has ball courts and this kind of dispersed distribution of settlement, right? As well as a lot of mortars, which is why it's called Los Morteros. There's a couple of these structures don't preserve very well. We excavate them by looking for the footprints of them, and later on these adobe compounds also don't, dirt melts, right? We call it melting archaeologically. It erodes and then spreads across the ground. On these adobe compounds, we often find, because they have these footprints, the cimientos, we call them, basically rocks placed in the ground, and the adobes tied onto that rock, right, by packing around it. So the walls actually sunk into the ground in one form or another. And so those can be underwhelming. And that's always my concern, is that people go out to these sites and are underwhelmed by them if they're expecting something like huge and massive, but build up in your imagination, right? And then I always tell people, because I work in a lot of these really kind of decentralized, dispersed communities, historic communities in the Southwest, to use their mind about what people are doing in those structures as well. So the spit house communities might not have a big footprint on the surface, but they've got a really big footprint on our Southwestern history.
How crucial is the size and scope of population for determining the strength and durability of horizontal, more egalitarian social and political order?
Yeah, so, it depends on who you ask, right? And everyone's got data to support it. A lot of folks in the kind of framework that we are often taught in school for understanding why states came about and that kind of stuff are really oriented around this idea of scale. And that once you get up to a certain scale, you have to have these ranked systems and these inequalities that pop up so that you can actually manage larger and larger groups of people. We have a lot of social systems archaeologically we see, historically we see, that we know don't work that way, right? And the problem is that we're stuck with these definitions of what civilization and state are based on these things from the Mediterranean. And so we have to think of like large numbers of people as encompassed within one bounded kind of entity. And then when you have that, when you have like 50,000 people trying to make a decision together, it's really hard to do consensus. The joke is that anyone who is afraid of anarchism has never participated in it because it's a crap load of committee meetings. Excuse me for saying crap. It's just like you just meet and meet and meet, right? Because you're not doing majoritarian voting. It's not 51% and then you're good to go. You're talking through any kind of concerns people have. What happens then is there's a lot of ways to manage that. And so a lot of groups in the history of Africa, at least the ones that I've read about in Africa, early European history, like pre-colonial history, pre-Rome, pre-Christianity in Europe, as well as obviously in the Americas, they scale it. And so they'll do regional kind of consensus decision-making, and then they'll elect someone from that group to go to the kind of next. So they have these kind of nested patterns of consensus making. We also have pretty large scale systems that we see in what we would call like city states, where we can tell in one form or another they're fairly horizontally organized. We don't know exactly what that decision-making process looked like. We just know it existed. And so, I mean, we can reconstruct ways that we know that large-scale numbers of people can make those decisions, but there's no guarantee that we know they could make those decisions. So we've seen city-states upwards of 50, 60,000 people, and going back 1,000 years, where people are making decisions like that.
And I think we have time for one more, and that is migrants and locals developed a good mixed lifestyle. Is one reason for this that each had equal conflict powers, similar to the previous and modern Cold War?
I'm not really sure what equal conflict powers means. Like if that means something like they were both able to kind of have an impact on the social system that they were living within, whether it was like through violence or potential violence. Maybe the interesting thing about the end of the classic period, what I would call a collapse, but it's the collapse of the platform mound elite structure, right? Not a collapse of the society in any way, shape, or form. But it's not accidental, right? It was intentionally torn apart by folks in the area. What we see when migrants first show up in some regions, and there's different reactions, if they're up in the Tunnel Basin, Phoenix Basin, or we're looking at like the San Pedro Valley, Safford Valley, there's different reactions to the migrants, but also similar patterns. In the San Pedro, what we see is originally there's tension, there's separation of sites, right? And we don't see a lot of evidence of violence, almost no evidence of violence during this time period. So O'odham histories talk about this as armies and warfare. David Martinez, who is an O'odham scholar, talks about it as a kind of analogy, right? Where we're probably seeing conflict, right? It's the easiest way to talk about conflict in a kind of dramatic verse without having to resort to, describing people's political tensions put on each other and social movements and things like that. So David Martinez doesn't think this period necessarily involved violence, but definitely conflict. And that's what we see like in the San Pedro. So when migrants first show up, there's a lot of tension. They have their own communities. The ancestral O'odham communities have their own as well. And within a generation, though, that's done. And we see maybe a couple generations in the San Pedro, but we start to see a mix really rapidly. And this has to do with early movement away from more Pueblo-like kind of political ritual structures that the migrants brought with them, like kiva systems, things like that, and a movement into more feast-based practices, which is very much a Pueblo thing and very much a Hohokam or ancestral O'odham thing, not to put firm boundaries on these, but they were in both systems, right, or both areas. And from there, we see a pretty rapid kind of synthesis, if you will. And so we still have some sites that are more kind of migrant oriented, I would say, but still have like evidence that there are locals incorporated into that. But most of them are more local oriented, but with some of the Salado stuff impressed on top of it. So I'm not so sure I would say, if I'm interpreting your question right, I'm not so sure I would say that it's the ability for each to maybe inflict violence on each other that allowed for this synthesis. I think it was more the fact that a lot of the Hohokam locals within a generation almost, certainly old enough that some of the elders in the community would remember not having platform-mound elites in their valley systems, controlling these kind of practices that their parents and them had been participating in before that, were, I think, very much pro moving into these systems that were pulling those apart. So I think it was common goals more than that sort of ability that they can both inflict violence on each other.
Thank you so much for spending your time with us today, Louis. We truly appreciate it.
I really appreciate you inviting me. Thank you so much, Annie.
Well, and thank you to our audience for also joining us. We hope you will join us again on February 26th with our next online presentation with Dr. Chad Hamill. I hope you all have a great day, everyone. Bye.